I am making the Marsh Grass Cardigan, which has this grassy motif that uses dip stitches. Dip stitches are where you work into a stitch below and draw up a loop to make these elongated loops. So you're dipping down into your fabric and pulling up a loop. And they're really quite easy. The only hard part is to know where to pull the loop up from. But with the marsh grass pattern, I've tried to make it very, very obvious, but where you pull your loops. There are 3 types of dip stitches in this marsh grass cardigan. There's the ones that go straight up and down. There's the ones that slant to the right. And there's the ones that slant to the left. Here I'm making the final dip stitch for this grassy tuft, and I'm going to work the central stitch. I'm going to knit the central stitch, then insert my right hand needle into this hole that's already been made where all the dip stitches for this particular motif originate. Insert my right hand needle into that loop, into that hole, wrap my yarn around the needle, and draw a loop up. The tension of these dip stitches is important. It's very easy to make them too tight, which will cause your fabric to kind of pucker in. So whenever I make a dip stitch, I always try to give a little tug on my right hand needle to make sure that that loop, it has plenty of space. And then keep knitting. This is the beginning of one of these dip stitches motifs. I've got the base of it, which is the 7 garter stitches at the bottom and then the 5 on top of them. And the one tricky thing is to figure out where to start. But I've tried to make that easy. So you have these 5 garter stitches with the 5 purl bumps on top. You want to find the central one, the 3rd garter stitch with its purl bump, and you insert your needle into the stitch directly above this central purl bump. So you see this stitch, it's already got a bit of a hole. You insert your needle there, wrap your yarn around your needle, and pull a loop up and through. Again, you want your tension to be fairly loose for these dip stitches, so give your right hand needle a bit of a tug to pull that loop up. And the other thing is, don't work the next stitch too tightly, because if you can look at the back, you're actually making dip stitch loops on the back of your work as well. But if you pull too tightly with this next stitch, you're going to be constricting your elongated loop on the front as well. So work into the next stitch fairly loosely and keep going until it's time to make your next dip stitch. The dip stitches that lean to the right are fairly easy to work. The ones to the left are a little bit trickier because you're trying to get your needle point backwards of where the working stitches are. So there's 2 ways that I do it. The first is similar to what you do with the right leaning dip stitches, but here you have to, I find it helps to bunch up the stitches on your right hand needle to give you a little bit more space. And you're going to be working into the same loop that you already drew a dip stitch up from. So you know where you're supposed to put your needle, you know where you're going. It's just a matter of getting there. And you can kind of pull your fabric and insert your needle into that same hole Wrap your yarn around at the back and pull a loop up from the front. I like to transfer this loop to the left-hand needle to give it that little extra tug to make sure I have enough space with my stitch before proceeding. The second way that I find maybe a little bit easier with these left-leaning dip stitches is to use a crochet hook. The size of the crochet hook isn't super important. It just needs to be small enough to fit through your knitting and big enough that it can grab your working yarn. So you insert your crochet hook to that same hole above the central garter stitch, and your working yarn is at the back. You use the crochet hook to grab the working yarn, pull a loop through to the front. You attach the dip stitch loops to other stitches. You work them together with other stitches on the wrong side row following the right side row in which you made the dip stitches. For left leaning loops, you want to attach the left leaning dip stitch loop, which is right here, to the stitch before them in the work. This is going to, I'm going to turn around the knitting so you can see. That's going to pull the stitch sort of away. If you attach the left leaning dip stitch loops to the stitch following them, you can see that it will make a rather large hole in your knitting. In order to do that, you work a slip slip purl. So to work a slip slip purl, you slip the first stitch knitwise, you slip that dip stitch loop knitwise, return both stitches to your left hand needle, and then work those through the back loop. If you look again at the right side of the work, you can see that that dip stitch is lying on top of the stitch you worked it with, and it looks nice and neat. The right leaning dip stitches are worked a little differently. It's actually a little easier. You work directly until you reach the dip stitch loop. See it on the front of the work. And you're going to work it together with the stitch following it to pull it away from that center. And you just purl those two stitches together. For the dip stitches that go straight up and down, those central dip stitches, those are similar to the right leaning dip stitches. You're just going to work the dip stitch loop together with the following stitch with the purl two together. When you're making your dip stitch loops and drawing them up, you want to try to make sure that they lie relatively flat, that they're not twisted over each other. However, once you turn your work back to the right side and you happen to notice that one of your dip stitches has its legs twisted, it's crossing over the top, and if you don't like the way that looks, it's pretty easy to fix. You don't need to rip out, you don't need to go back to this stitch and try to fix things. You simply just untwist those stitches on the right side so that they're parallel to each other.